And now for another Muppet Thought of the Week.
Is it reasonable to propose that the fundamental cybernetic frame is narrative? And I would say pretty much none of the theorizers, except for maybe Piaget, who have a cybernetic model, have drawn a relationship between narrative and cybernetic models. But here's why. I think, if you look at someone like Geoffrey Gray, who was incredibly intelligent and well-educated psychologist, really an outstanding scholar in my estimation, he derived his cybernetic models from Russian cybernetic models that were based on the presupposition that what you do when you move in the world is you compare the current state of the world to the state you expect. And that's wrong. It's wrong in an important way, because you're not an expectancy machine. You're not a cold, cognitive, computational machine. You don't act in the world in accordance with what you expect. You act in the world in accordance with what you want. And that's like, it's a critical difference. So if you read Gray's, for example, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, and you get a sense of the cybernetic model that's underneath there, there's never any real mention of motivation per se, except for emotional motivation. There's the approach system and the fear system and the negative emotion system, but motivation as such doesn't seem to enter into it. You know, the fact that entities, animals, are hungry and thirsty and desirous of sexual contact and playful and all those sorts of things. You can read Jaak Panksepp for better descriptions of those systems, but those things have to be brought together. And my proposition, as soon as you bring them together, is you get narrative, because you're talking about people who are motivated and want things, and then descriptions of the structures that they use to operate in the world to get the things that they want. That's a narrative. Now, so you can think about that. That's how it looks to me. So, here's another set of propositions. The propositions are this, and that is that the systems that we use to perceive and categorize the world did evolve. And they evolved in a manner that's standard with regards to how things evolve, which is that new things are built on old things. And you can't escape from the old things. You have to have them, they're present in your current model. So you can't get somewhere from nowhere. And so you're constrained by your starting points. And so I would like to offer you the proposition that the basic sub-elements of our conceptual structures, and therefore of our narrative structures, are symbolic representations of the world as a place to act that are based in our long prehistory of fundamentally social existence. And so I'm just going to give you a brief introduction into some of those categories. And I think that the more probable, the more long-lasting a phenomena is, the more it's probable that a biological entity in contact with that phenomena is going to have adapted to it perceptually, behaviorally, and conceptually. So one of the things we might think about is, given your nervous system, given that you're an evolved organism, what have been the most permanent features of your evolutionary history to which you've adapted? And I'm going to talk about some that are more complex than the fact that the ground beneath your feet is generally firm. We've adapted to that, you know, and we've adapted to the presence of light, and we've adapted to the presence of an atmosphere, and so forth. Those are all very constant phenomena. But then there are constants of social being that are virtually as old, and we've talked about that a little bit. One of them I posited was the dominance hierarchy. I gave you some evidence that that's at least 400 million years old. But then there's also the fact of sexual differentiation. You know, one of the fundamental facts of human being and human social being is that there are, roughly speaking, two genders, and that that's permanent. So a masculine element of the social world and a feminine element of the social world are constants, just as the social world is a constant. And then I would say mothers and fathers are very constant. They're as constant as mammals are, right? So because we've had mothers and fathers, roughly speaking, since we became mammals. And there are some reptiles that are actually manifest some pretty decent parental behavior, and it occurs in birds as well, so, and even in fish. So, you know, it's pretty constant. And then I would say the figure of the child is a constant, and the figure of the old man and the old woman are constants. And there's some more important constants that are necessary to consider. One constant is that you have a territory. The other constant is that there's something outside that territory. Another constant is that you can be prey for a predator. That's a big one. And then another constant is there are predators. Okay, so your conceptual systems, the ones that you utilize today, are going to be grounded in representations, embodied representations, and conceptual representations that have already structured themselves in accordance with the existence of those constants. And you're drawing on them as part of the representational system that orients you in the world. And weirdly enough, it actually works, which is a very peculiar thing as far as I can tell. So one of the things that's struck me as, in some sense, incomprehensible is that the use of these fundamental cognitive categories, when you apply them to a world that in some sense isn't objectively configured in accordance with those conceptions, it works, it functions, if it actually applies so that you can live using those categories and you're successful. So anyways, that's a tough one. So as we move, so I said, well, you have to have a frame of reference, and the frame of reference is cybernetic, and then there's an analogy between the cybernetic structure and a narrative structure, and that's a very tight analogy. It's likely an identity. Okay, so that's a set of premises. The next premise is that within those narratives, there are constants of representation and action, and that those are human procedural universals, so things that we do, and then there are human conceptual universals. And those conceptual universals, the grounding of those conceptual universals is in ancient biological systems that had to conceptualize, that failed if they didn't conceptualize a certain realm of constants in the environment. And I laid out the constants. Masculinity, femininity, youth, old age, explored territory, unexplored territory, prey, and predator. Now, I'm not saying that's all of them, because I don't think it is all of them. But we can get an awful long way with just those. Now, if you read terror management theorists, the terror management theorists will tell you something like, your belief system, which is kind of conceptualized as a system of interrelated abstractions, prevents you from terror of death. All right, so that's Ernest Becker. That's Ernest Becker's theory. It's a pretty good theory. It was grounded on Freudian presuppositions. And he developed that theory in a book called The Denial of Death, which is also a pretty good book. There's a problem with the basic theory as far as I can tell, though. Well, there's multiple problems. It's not a bad theory, and at certain levels of analysis it's a pretty good theory, but it has serious flaws. The first flaw is your belief system is not merely conceptual. You act it out, and that's really important. And it isn't also not the belief system that protects you. It's the fact that other people have organized a society around you predicated on that belief system, and the society works. Like, it's not a psychological, society isn't a psychological phenomena. You have a representation of it, and the representation in part is a psychological phenomena, but the fact that you can sit here in relative peace, harmony, security, warmth, and light is not a psychological phenomena. It's embedded in the world. So a lot of what protects you from death anxiety isn't a psychological structure that stops you from being afraid. It's an actual structure that stops you from dying. And so both are right, but you can't forget about the most fundamental one, right? The most fundamental one is the most fundamental one, and if events occur, maybe even social conflict, and I perceive that the consequences of that social conflict is not only a disruption of what I believe, but also a disruption of the society that protects and shelters me, then of course I'm going to respond negatively to that, and it's not for merely conceptual reasons. It's because if the substructure of the society is actually destroyed, I'm going to freeze to death in the dark immediately. So we don't want to make things more psychological than they actually are. And we have to remember that these structures, the dominance hierarchy is represented, but it also exists out there in the world, and it's a real thing. Okay, now we're going to progress through some models of emotional processing, and then some neuropsychological models, and then we're going to get to the symbolic domain. That's what's going to happen now. So, you're going from point A to point B, and you're looking at the world through that framework. So that framework also configures your perceptions, and it also configures your emotional responses. And so it's variable. But within the variability, there are constants. And the constants are, you're going somewhere, you come from somewhere, and when you go from one to the other, there's only three things that can happen. Something you want, that's a good thing, that gets you to where you're going, and it validates the theoretical integrity of your perceptual frame. That's an important thing, right? It does two things. You get to where you're going, and it provides evidence that your current model is actually functional. So if you fail, both of those things go into question. One is, you're not getting where you want to go, that's a problem, but the worst one is, oh, the whole system that you're using to try to get to where you go also might be wrong, and you don't know where.
Join us again next week for another Muppet Thought of the Week.